In the 2019 federal election campaign, the now member for Corangamite, when she was a candidate, very regrettably decided to run billboards around the electorate when I was the Assistant Minister for Disability Services. And those billboards said, Libby Coker putting the heart back into the NDIS. This was an example of the shabby way in which the Labor Party has a very dark history of politicising the NDIS, crass politicising of people with disability. And I say shame on the member for Corangamite for the way that she attempted to use my role as Assistant Minister to score cheap, crass political points. We have a really proud history of caring for people with disability. But right now, in this chamber, I say, and the Coalition says, putting the heart in these changes to the NDIS means ensuring there is proper consultation with the sector. And we have seen a gross shortfall in that respect. The Coalition will support sensible measures in this bill, measures that the Coalition sought to implement when it was in government, but Labor actively campaigned against. That is the height of hypocrisy. So at the appropriate stage, the Coalition will move amendments to improve this scheme, to preserve the scheme's integrity, to ensure the sustainability of the scheme, to allow it to continue to improve the lives of some of the most vulnerable in our community. However, as I say, and as we have made very clear, thorough consultation with the sector is absolutely vital. We recognise the critical need to put the NDIS back onto a sustainable footing. It was very much our focus when we were in government. And all that Labor could say then, and the now Minister could say then, Mr Shorten, was that we didn't know what we were talking about. I do say it is very concerning that the Senate Community Affairs Committee was not given the opportunity to consult the sector on government amendments tabled on the day of the public hearing. This in itself shows the need for further consultation. The 2.5 days of hearings conducted by the committee pointed to significant concerns from the disability community about the lack of detail and the potential unintended consequences of the current legislation without significant amendment. There is broad consensus in the disability community about the need for greater consideration of this bill. And while the Coalition is willing to work constructively with the government, in stark contrast to the shabby politics we saw from Labor when we were in government, it is disappointing the government has opted to reject a reasonable request for the extension to the reporting date for the committee and for a meaningful hearing day, particularly with the National Disability Insurance Agency. The NDIS is changing the lives of more than 660,000 Australians. And as I said before, the Coalition has a very strong record of support for the NDIS. The Coalition was and is committed to a fully funded NDIS as a demand-driven scheme, and has always been clear that the NDIS needs to be sustainable to ensure it delivers for many generations to come. There's no doubt that Labor underinvested in the NDIS when it was established, failing to invest in the unmet needs of people with disability. And in fact, back in just before the 2013 election, the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard rushed through the NDIS, contrary to the recommendations that were made, because it was all about getting runs on the board rather than getting the legislation right. And we reflect on the shabby way in which the Labor Party stood in the way of the Coalition's attempts to put the scheme on a sustainable footing when we were in government. Mr Shorten even accused the Coalition of pearl-clutching kabuki theatre, claiming the NDIS was tracking just as predicted and that the Coalition was hyping fictional cost blowouts. When Mr Shorten was the Shadow Minister for the NDIS, he said, "You can't move around the corridors of Parliament in Canberra without tripping over a Coalition Minister whispering the scheme is unsustainable. I'm here to tell you today that is a lie." The Labor Party, when they were in opposition, were grossly irresponsible, because unless this scheme is sustainable, it will not survive. This scheme is incredibly important for tens and hundreds of thousands of Australians, but it's got to be put back on track. In the lead-up to the 2022 election, Mr Shorten even tried to argue the former Coalition government made cuts to the NDIS, even though the Coalition rescued the NDIS by investing a record $157.8 billion over 4 years to support more than what was then 550,000 Australians living with disability. Mr Shorten went to the election promising that no plans would go backwards under his watch and the scheme was sustainable as it was. Now, he claims the scheme is growing in its cost base too quickly. So in government and mugged by the reality of a complex growing scheme, Mr Shorten now not only questions the sustainability of the NDIS, but blames young people with autism and those with psychosocial conditions for these cost pressures, which is completely unacceptable. So what people with disability, NDIS participants and their family need is real honesty from this minister, not just to be used as part of a crass political campaign. Under Labor, we saw a very poorly designed scheme, allowing the states to walk away from providing key services to those with disability. As I mentioned, when this was first implemented, it was rushed for purely political purposes, and in doing so, the scheme was botched. It was implemented in the dying days of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd fiasco of a government for pure political purposes, and we are now all paying the price for that. I mean, imagine implementing legislation which effectively imposed all of the liability on the Commonwealth for cost increases while capping the liability for the states. Now, that's all well and good, but of course any change in the legislation requires the consent of the states, more or less. And so, from the very beginning, this was very flawed. We've recently seen many media reports highlighting stories where serial sexual abusers, rapists and pedophiles are receiving substantial support from the National Disability Insurance Scheme, sometimes worth more than $1 million, to live under supervision in the community after their release from detention. Urgent review is needed to disclose how many individuals with serious criminal convictions are receiving NDIS funding. How many of those people are on self-managed plans? During a Senate estimate spillover in March, we learned that 2,500 NDI participants have interacted with the justice system. So this NDIS minister, Mr Shorten, needs to come clean on how many NDIS participants have serious criminal convictions and how many of those are on self-managed plans. This is vitally important not just to protect the safety of carers and providers, but to also preserve the integrity of the scheme. There is no doubt that there is widespread abuse and there is widespread fraud. That includes giving NDIS participants seemingly unlimited rights to access a range of services, including sex therapy and the like. During February Senate estimates, we asked questions probing what specific criteria or guidelines the NDIS has for determining which animals qualify as support animals. Upon ongoing questioning around this, the NDI officials could not and would not categorically rule out that a participant used NDIS funds for the cremation of their pet rat. I mean, we heard, and I quote, "We don't have personal details by which we're able to verify or validate that." Now, I don't want to reflect in any way on the incredible work that this scheme does. It is changing lives. It is profoundly providing support to those who most need this support. But all Australians, including the families of those with disability, want to make sure that the very substantial investment we are making in the NDIS is made for the right purposes. It gets to where it needs to go. So, in looking at the bill itself, and there's been a range of very serious concerns raised by the bill, it's not clear from the bill what a participant can do if they do not agree with the outcome of the needs assessment. So NDIA decisions are notorious for being inconsistent and variable, and there does not appear to be any avenue for review. The new definition says the NDIS will only fund 8 categories of supports, and these are based on selected elements in the United Nations Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities. However, by leaving out other elements, the bill also excludes some supports from NDIS funding, and insofar as the transparency of that decision-making, we have really very serious concerns. The review recommendations itself contain numerous contentious recommendations. The drafting of the bill lacked opportunity for consultation. Our position, and those we represent, is that without examination and scrutiny of the full and complete proposed changes, the bill would deliver a result in the future that just looks not only uncertain, but provides essentially the scope to deliver injustice for people with disability who really need support. So there is an enormous amount of work to do to make sure that this bill is fit for purpose. We have raised deep concerns about the lack of a co-design approach to developing the bill. I mean, it's unclear who has been consulted in its development, and apparently some disability representative groups were consulted and not others. And that's just not good enough. We need to make sure, if we are going to make these major changes to the way the NDIS operates, we need to make sure that we have properly consulted. There has not even been a formal government response to the Disability Royal Commission or the NDIS review, so we're even surprised about the release of the bill at this point in time. So, as I say, Madam Acting President, there is much work to be done, and that is why the Coalition is calling on further consultation rather than what we are seeing in recent days from the Minister, which is a tantrum. He's having a tantrum because his hypocrisy is being exposed. He wants to try and bury this hypocrisy, and we will not cop it. Thank you.